Hey there, this is Ray, and this is another episode of Healing from Sexual Abuse. Though whether or not you have experienced sexual abuse, I do believe these videos will be helpful to all people from all walks of life. As always, this is my story. It's my experience with healing from sexual abuse. My story is not your story. I welcome you to listen to whatever I have to say, take what benefits you, and just leave the rest. There's really not one right way to heal from sexual abuse, but this is me just offering my experience with it. Today's topic is going to be storytelling. The reason I've chosen this topic of telling stories is because stories are an immensely powerful thing. And stories can be an extremely powerful tool both for encouragement and empowerment for others, and also as a way to destroy and tear down others. So I want to kind of talk about that juxtaposition of stories, the stories we both tell ourselves and the stories that we have that can be told to the world. So I started my blog, Our Stories Untold, based on the idea that, as far as I knew, no one in the Mennonite church had really come forward with their story of sexual abuse. And I had a dream, actually, that came to me when I was flying on an airplane, that I was not the only one, and I needed to tell my story and open up a space for others to do the same. So that's the premise that Our Stories Untold began on. Even though I started Our Stories Untold, it took me a while until I was able to tell my own one story of sexual abuse, the one of when I was 3 years old. And the thing that was keeping me back was that I wasn't raped as a 3-year-old, which is, I think, partially why it took me a really long time to recognize that what happened was, in fact, molestation and abuse. But also, I feared that people would reject my story and that they wouldn't believe it for its authenticity, which is kind of absurd because it's my story, therefore an authentic story. We all create these stories for ourselves. So that story that I had playing in my own head was, your story isn't legitimate enough because it wasn't violent enough, which is just a very sad belief to have within me. Another story that I kept inside was my story of my sexual identity, the fact that I am a queer woman. And these stories were kept inside because of stories that I had heard in church and because of stories that I had heard throughout my life. Some of these stories is the idea that sin is equated with sexuality, and that somehow having sex or being in sexual relations with others is somehow sinful behavior. Additionally, that the way that we identify ourselves sexually and the way we interact with those in the world is also a sinful behavior. So because of these stories of Christian doctrine that had been kind of woven into my life, into the fabric of who I was, the stories that I had involving sexuality and abusive use of sexual power also became woven into my life. And I felt like I couldn't open up about those stories because they were sinful. They were disgusting. It took me deconstructing the stories that I heard that were equating sexuality with sinfulness and shame. It took me deconstructing those and getting rid of those ideologies from my own being, which meant retelling a different story. When I started constructing my own knowledge of my sexual identity and my knowledge of my sexual abuse story, I had to reconstruct it in a way that positively fit into my life and that allowed me freedom and joy to experience this beautiful world that I am thankfully born into during this lifetime. So once you realize that you have your story and you want to tell that story because it is this story inside of you that has never had ears to be listened to, which is a very important step, telling your story. After you do the telling of the story, you actually have the possibility of restructuring and reframing that story. I've done this with a lot of different experiences, both with my 3-year-old self who was abused and also with my 15-year-old self who was in an abusive relationship. I'm going to share with you the stories of how I reframed my 3-year-old abuse story. The first step I did towards this was in therapy with my therapist in Pittsburgh, and she asked me to revisit my little girl. At that time, it was excruciating painful. I couldn't do it, honestly. I just would bawl and bawl and bawl, and I really couldn't have a conversation with that 3-year-old. I didn't totally understand why, but a lot of it was my own self-guilt towards this 3-year-old that this horrible thing had happened to her. And so that was my first attempt at trying to talk to my 3-year-old self. In other words, restructure that storyline that I had told myself from that experience. The next time that I really remember going into this was this past summer. I actually opened up the possibility to get a letter from my abuser, who is in prison currently. And so I received the letter from him, which I was totally ready to do and open to do. That does not mean that you ever have to do that. It was the place of healing that I was at that time. And so I welcomed this letter in, which set me off in a way I didn't totally expect, but of course would happen. I spent a lot of time processing it, a lot of time crying, a lot of time working through a lot of really, really deep emotion. So one thing that came of that was I was sitting on my meditation cushion at night, and I was led to start singing a forgiveness song that we often did in our community. And I wasn't doing it towards the abuser. I was really just led to sing the song, and it goes, Ho'oponopono, 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 Ho'oponopono. I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, thank you. I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, thank you. And it keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. It's actually from a Hawaiian tradition. So I was singing this song and bringing in different people who I had had conflict with, throughout my life or in that moment. And all of a sudden, a little girl who lived at the community, a 3-year-old girl, popped into the cushion. Like, she was sitting right across from me. And I was like, what's she doing here? That's very strange. Like, I don't need to forgive her. So I, went with it, and I kept singing the song towards her, directing it towards her, all my heart towards her. And all of a sudden, she morphed into 3-year-old me. And so as I kept singing the song to 3-year-old me, I just started bawling. And then 3-year-old me took me back to my abuse scene, which happened right beside some lambs. It was Easter. We were back there in the scene, and I was singing this song to her and just bawling and bawling and bawling and asking, kind of begging her for forgiveness. And it was actually a 15-year-old me who was asking for the forgiveness. And I realized that a reason I couldn't go back and talk to 3-year-old me originally was because I had this story of guilt that lived inside of me, that I somehow lacked the ability to protect 3-year-old me. I know it's absurd, but I really did believe somewhere inside of me that this was my fault, that because 3-year-old me got abused, I had done something wrong. I lacked the ability, the know with it all to actually prevent that abuse from happening. And so what I did in that moment was I actually took 3-year-old me from the moment where she was going to encounter the abuse, and I took her by the hand and I took her to the lambs, and we pet the lambs instead. And then we came onto a swing that was off of a tree nearby the scene, and we swung and we laughed and we enjoyed each other's company, and it was beautiful. It was childish. It was just quite stunning. So in that moment, what I did was I restructured my abuse story. Not only did I realize that I had this guilt that was completely unnecessary, that was a part of my abuse story, I was able to overcome that guilt, and I was actually able to reparent my wounded child, my wounded abused person. I was able to go back to that scene and do the thing that didn't happen in the time and place. So I was able to take her by the hand and remove her from the situation, and I was able to play, which playing is something 15-year-old me did not do. 15-year-old me was actually in an abusive relationship, trying to be way more of an adult than she really was ready to be. In that moment, I actually reframed both stories. I was able to bring back the childhood of the 15-year-old me, and I was able to embrace 3-year-old me and recover her from the situation, reparent her. And if we want to get scientific on this, in that moment, what I was actually doing was a neurological refiguring of my brain. I was able to actually retell the story in a different way. And by ingraining that story in my mind, my whole body responds to that new story. And in effect, that is trauma healing. That is how my body is then able to start responding to that story with a beautiful moment of healing instead of this moment of when I was a dysfractured human being. So there is a little component of storytelling. I think storytelling is so important. If you've been abused, tell someone your story. If you can't tell someone your story, write it down. Tell yourself the story. And throughout time, trust me, it takes time. We can restructure these stories. We can reframe these stories. We can recreate these stories. And actually, I'm at the point in time where I don't really want to tell that abuse story anymore. Not because it didn't happen to me, not because I'm denying a piece of my past, but because that actually doesn't feel authentic. I'm not the victim anymore. I'm not even the survivor anymore. I'm now the thriver. I thrive off of this experience that happened to me, not saying that that justifies the experience or that that experience should have happened at all. But because that experience did happen, I am now able to, for example, make this video, which I never would have dreamed of doing otherwise. I reclaim my own story as thriver, which means that I don't choose to tell that story of abuse in the same victimized way that maybe once upon a time I would have. So thank you for listening. I hope this was another helpful episode of Healing from Sexual Abuse. As always, I would love to hear from your stories. I would love to hear comments, and I just want to share the love with you. So thank you so much.